you never know what life is going to bring you. And it was just a reminder to me of just how strong we all are and how much resilience we have and tenacity. Were there dark times? Absolutely. I've shared those. I've talked through those. But just know that, like, no matter what comes in the wake of death, you can get through it.
My mom has stage 4 cancer in her bones and in her breast. My dad's disease was 15 years, he died of ALS. I made a podcast about death, seemed like the thing to do. And if you're sad by all of this, well, you're gonna die too. Toya, I'm so excited to have you here today. I'm really looking forward to learning about your story. Thank you for being here all the way in Dallas, Texas, even though we're virtual. I'm excited.
Thank you for having me so much, Chelsea. I'm so honored to be on your show, and I'm excited to let's have this conversation as well, too.
Let's do this thing. So one question I ask all my guests right off the bat is about your goldfish moment. And this was the first time you thought about or conceptualized death in some way. For some people, it was a goldfish. Is there a moment from your childhood that comes to mind? Goldfish moment. Did your goldfish die? Goldfish moment. Did it make you cry?
Oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way. And I did have goldfish growing up who did die. Like, most goldfish do die.
Right.
You know what? It's funny because the first memory I have of death, or like a funeral, and I was so small, but when I was 5 years old, my grandfather passed away. And it was my mother's father. And what I could remember, I have these like memories of like being at the funeral and like seeing my mother cry. And I was just like, why are you crying? Like, what's happening? Like, you know, and her trying to explain it to me, because I didn't really remember much of my grandfather. So I always think about that. And it's just crazy, like, how that memory sticks. I do remember my goldfish dying and being sad about it and kind of being told, like, this is what happens. They just don't live long.
Right? I love that you actually had a goldfish, because
I did.
A lot of people in the goldfish moment did not have a goldfish. I feel like I don't know. I feel like a goldfish is a good way to introduce death to kids, for lack of better words, because it's low pressure, right? Lower stakes, but still teaches a good lesson. So yay for you having a goldfish. Do you remember their name?
Oh gosh, no, not at all.
Who knows, right?
Who knows if we even named them? But, and I was around like 6 or 7. I don't know. They were just goldfish. We had like an aquarium. There was goldfish. I think there were like other fish in there. I think it started with like my older brother, and my mother just like kept the aquarium, and then like I bought goldfish or whatever. I feel like that's how they introduce you. Because then when I was in college, I did have like a betta, and I tried to have fish again, and that did not work either. So that was it. Growing up, no dogs or cats in the home.
Copy that. And can you share with us a little bit more about who you did grow up with, where you grew up, etc., and if you could walk us through the timeline through the loss of your parents in college?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas, which, if most people have not heard of Fort Worth, Texas, is right outside of Dallas. We're kind of like, I tell people it's like the Twin Cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis, rather. It's like Fort Worth and Dallas. So I grew up there, and I am the youngest of a lot of siblings. And like truly
12, right?
Yes. So
amazing.
I have 12 siblings, and I like to say Papa was a Rolling Stone, because I am the last of 10. And then my mother had 3 kids from a previous marriage. So altogether, I have 12, and I'm the youngest. So when I grew up in the home, there was my mom and my dad when I was born. And then only one of my sisters was young enough to still be at the home. And she was 17, and she was a junior in high school. Everybody else was like in college or grown. They don't like to say it, but I was a oopsie baby. You know, back then, women didn't think they could get pregnant at 38 years old. So
right.
My mother started having kids when she was 19. And anyway, so that's who I grew up in the home with. And then my parents split when I was about 2. I don't really have any memories of my dad in my home. So growing up, I was just raised by a single mother, and it was me and her. So I really had like an only child experience, I tell people, because my siblings were all grown. By the time I was 6 or 7, they were getting married and moving all over the world. So it really was just me and my mom in my home and growing up. And it was great. We had a nice childhood, and that was just all I ever knew, and things were good. I didn't have many issues growing up. We grew up like in a suburban neighborhood. And so things were fine in Fort Worth. And so, yeah, fast forward, I did all my schooling here, and then I went to college. I stayed in Texas. So I was only about 2.5 hours away. I went to Texas A&M University. So it's just further south near Houston. So what's interesting is my father had prostate cancer. And around my junior year in high school, my mother was the one that told me, because she was like, your dad doesn't want to tell you like first, but he shared this with me. And I was just like, oh, okay. And so she was like, you should call him and talk about it. So I knew that. But what I knew about prostate cancer at the time was it was very survivable, right? Like a lot of men have that and are able to beat that. And at that same time, my mother was sick. So she had got diagnosed with heart disease. She had, diabetes, and was experiencing some complications for that. And I remember when I was going off to start my junior year, she wasn't well. And I was like, well, I should stay back to be with you or take care of you, et cetera. And she was like, no, I'll be fine. So I really had this thing where I thought she was getting better, and I sometimes think like she willed herself to like appear to be better because she didn't want me to stop. Both of them communicated that, like, no matter what was going on with them health-wise, you stay in college, like everything will be fine. So ironically, I was expecting my father to pass more so than my mother, because I thought like, okay, they had talked about her doing dialysis, they had other things to help. Basically, she passed away first. So she went to the hospital like before Thanksgiving and just never came out. The condition worst. And then she was in the ICU, and then she was in medically induced coma. And so she passed away the first week of December, literally like the week before finals. So I, went home, funeral, all of that. And I told my professors what was going on. And every single one of them was like, whenever you're ready, or, if you don't want to, this. And, all I could think about was both of my parents, like, no, finish college, because I was going to take it incomplete. But I drove back, and all of my professors waited on me to tell them when I was ready to take the test. They had the classroom. It was just me and them taking my final exams. So I came back a week after I buried my mother to do my exams. My father was so ill that he could not attend my mother's funeral. So that's when it started to set in for me that like, okay, he's a lot more worse off. And so that was December. And then 2 months later, he passed in February. So that was kind of where I found myself at 21 years old without parents.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's incredibly challenging to imagine, and yet this does happen, and people specifically who have lost two parents back to back will really relate to this. What was it like for you at that time? Obviously, I would say, I'm not going to assume that's a hard time, right? So I'm going to ask you another way. What was the biggest challenge of losing both of your parents back to back? Who did you speak to at that time about what you were going through?
Yeah. So I don't know any other way to say it, but I felt alone. And it's so interesting because I always say, like, I guess God knew what he was doing by giving me big sisters, because I definitely had them. And when my mom was like very sick and pretty much on her deathbed there in the hospital, that was one of the last things that she told like my brother and one of my aunts. She was like, well, I'm just so worried about Toya because I'm the youngest. And they were like, we got her. So I definitely feel like I had the support from my older siblings, aunties, uncles, but I just felt really alone. Me and my mother had a very close relationship. As a matter of fact, my college roommate would always joke. She was like, she's like, your mother calls here every day. If I wasn't there, she would leave on the answer. I mean, I'm 40 and I'm proud of that. So I'm old enough to have like an answering machine. And so we just had a really unique relationship. So I missed her and I felt alone. And there were some very dark days. I am a huge proponent of therapy now. I wish I would have gone to therapy immediately, but I did not. I actually did not start my therapy journey until I was like in my early 30s. So that was a big stretch of time. But I did grow up in the church. And so what I did do is I got connected to like a local church community. It's funny because I went away to college and like a lot of people, I just got away from going to church because it's like college, And so
Right.
I found myself wanting to get back connected. And it was actually this small group of women that I got connected to in like a church group. And I really give them credit for helping me walk through that journey. They didn't understand it themselves, but they had all been through different things and they just were with me through that. My roommate at the time was with me through it a lot. So I would talk to her. She had older parents and ended up passing a couple years later. So she kind of just related to this idea of, she knew herself that she probably didn't have much longer with her dad because he was much, much older, even older than my parents. But there were dark days. I mean, I have talked about before, and in my book that I didn't know what to call it then, to be honest, but I was depressed. I did for some time take anti-anxiety medication. And mind you, this was all while I was in a rigorous academic program. I was in the honors program at Texas A&M. And I'm like, it's nothing but a miracle. But those last like 2 years, I was on like the dean's list every semester. Like somehow I managed to like get the best GPA that I ever had.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah. But I will say there were a lot of things that I feel like I missed out on because I think I kind of like closed myself off so much and just kind of got focused on graduating, getting through grief. I didn't pledge a sorority. I did in those last 2 years have a college boyfriend. I didn't do as much fun stuff because I was like, I'm just trying to make it out here. I'm just trying to make it today. And I kind of, all those things that I was excited about being involved in college, I kind of pulled away from them and just kind of stayed focused on getting myself better and trying to make my parents proud, I felt, by doing good in school.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's like that age is interesting. I mean, of course, totally different life experiences that everyone has had, but me being 19, you being 21, of course, I'm relating in the sense of the college loss experience is just, yeah, you're just trying to show up day by day and there's so much going on. It's like, you could do this, you could do this. Some people are the happiest they've ever been. I'm sure everyone feels alone to a point for the first time exercising your independence. And yet what you went through specifically is extremely isolating. And I appreciate you being honest about your depression. And it's like, yeah, I didn't know that I was depressed then either. So I can relate. I'm like, yes, that is what that was.
I didn't know what to call it. I didn't understand mental health in that way. We didn't speak about it in our family. And I know there were people in my family that went through it. And I don't even know if I had what I thought depression was. I wasn't that, or even I was maybe unwilling to admit that I was depressed because of stigma.
Right. What has it been like as you started your therapy journey in your 30s through now? Or like, how did you first reach out? How did you first get involved in therapy? And what advice would you have for others who are considering doing so?
Yeah. So again, it was something like, so then, fast forward, I'm a grown up now, working professionally and stuff. And I'm obviously, have a worldview now and I'm a culture person. So I understood what, therapy was. I had moved to Chicago. So I was living in Chicago at the time. So the more I started hearing about mental health and therapy, I kind of was like, this is probably something that I need, but there was still a lot of stigma for whatever reason that I had associated with it. Like, well, what's wrong with me? So I first had to become aware that like something was wrong, right? So at the point when I started my therapy journey, I was severely overweight, and I was never like a super skinny person, but I always kind of maintained a fairly healthy weight. And when I moved to Chicago, I found myself putting on a little weight. I mean, deep pizza and seasonal depression because of the winter definitely gets you, right?
Right.
But there was this point to where I put on, it was like over like, gosh, it was like I blew up. I put on like over 40 pounds in like a year, and I was eating it. It wasn't like some type of hormonal thing. I was in just a series of like toxic relationships. And I was like, maybe I have daddy issues, maybe I haven't processed this grief. But again, I still have this stigma. As a person of faith, there are a lot of misconceptions about the idea of therapy and, pray it all away. And so that was impacting me. And so the reason that I started therapy is actually the church that I attended, they focused on debunking that myth. And at a counseling service that worked with our church. And it was one Sunday, the counselors came up and they were like, we're offering free sessions to any of the members, and that if you want a consultation. And I was like, I was very unhappy with my body, and I knew that was a problem. I was very unhappy with the state of my relationships. And I also at the time was contemplating a career change. So I was like, I got a lot going on. This feels like a good time.
Yes.
So I had that first session, and, it's just kind of like a get to know you session. She's asking me questions. And of course, like, I'm like bawling when she starts asking questions. So she was like, I think you can benefit from therapy. So that started my journey. And, a big part of it was that at the time that my father died, as I said, my parents split when I was 2. And unfortunately, my father just wasn't as present as he should have been. And right when he started to be present, when I was graduating high school, obviously I'm in college, I was doing my own thing, right? So I would talk to him and see him when I could, then he got sick. So there was this part of, while I felt like I had this complete relationship and closure with my mother, I didn't have that with my father. He wasn't present, and then he passed away before we could resolve a lot of things. And that was impacting my relationships that I was having with men. All of that, feeling alone. I was depressed. Again, this depression thing came up again, because similarly, now I'm living in a city where I didn't have friends or family. I'm getting older. You're starting to see other people get married, build families. I don't have that. I'm reminded that I'm like this orphan. All of these things were coming up, and I was just eating my feelings and unprocessed grief and, unfulfilling career. And so that's kind of what started my therapy journey.
Beautiful share. And I love the honesty. And I think we all, like, everyone can benefit from therapy at some point in our lives, right? Like, okay, maybe we don't all need to go twice a week for 20 years in a row, but like, it's like every couple years, check in. Even just going for 3 or 4 months is a huge, huge way to change some of the way that you're thinking. I was going regularly throughout the pandemic, even online. Like, I never thought I wanted to do virtual therapy. I benefited tremendously from that. So it's incredible what is available to people now.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I'm like, I still know people that have never been. And I'm like, you could benefit from that.
Oh, I am put normalized therapy on a t-shirt, and I will wear it every day. And I always tell people, I'm like, some of us are in therapy because the people around us won't go to therapy, because we have to deal.
That's funny. Yes.
We have to deal with you who won't go to therapy.
That is so true. That is so real.
It is.
LOL. I'm like relating to that hardcore. I'm like, just at this point, we're just spending our entire therapy session talking about like the 2 people in our lives that refuse.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I totally because like I said, I started when I was 33, but that's been a 7-year journey. Like, I just kind of stopped going within the last year. And yeah, definitely like the like right pre-pandemic and then like during pandemic. My adult therapy was all about at the time my partner who was like, let me tell you more about this. He became the whole sessions.
Oh my gosh. You know, when there's one person that's taking up the whole session, there's something there. There's
There
something
was
to
something there.
unpack.
Exactly.
Toya, I also wanted to ask you, is there something about grieving in the Black experience specifically that you wish other people knew? And I know that you're not speaking for everyone, but if there's something that comes to mind, would love to hear.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I mean, you've heard me say it all throughout the interview. I think church is a big piece of the Black community. And like you said, does not speak for everyone, because I definitely have people in my inner circle that are Black who did not grow up in church, but it's very rare, to be clear. So I think that makes it unique, right? Because in the church, in the Black church, you can literally Google that and there's stuff that comes up around it. That's how we kind of refer to it. There are a lot of traditions that come along with like the funeral. The funeral should be this happy occasion. It's a homegoing celebration. She's going to be with Jesus or whatever. And but I'm like, people don't always feel like that, right? Like, great, my mother gets to be with Jesus. I want her here, and I don't want to celebrate that, right? So I think for a lot of people, when it comes to grieving, those traditions that are held true, everything from the way you mourn and bury your loved one gets complicated. And the second piece, as I mentioned, this idea that God will comfort you. And like I said, initially, that was what I went to, right? I had that small group community. But I think sometimes some of us have a hard time with seeking therapy, calling out what with depression wise. So what can happen is you kind of go into this closet, if you will, and you can start doing that in unhealthy ways. I have talked to another friend who, when her mother passed away, like she acted out in a certain way. Again, like I said, I got addicted for a little while to medication to kind of help me just go to sleep and function. And that's not necessarily healthy, but because of that environment that some of us grow up in the church, it can be not encouraged to seek therapy to address the depression and the grief. With that being said, there's so many happening, and because the conversation about mental health is there, that's great. Secondly, again, like just our experiences, I think especially like losing a mother in the Black community, women are the matriarchs of the family. And that experience, a lot of people lose a cousin or their dad, but when Black people lose their mother, it is a big, big deal. And so I think that's unique for us too, because our mothers in the Black community, they set the tone for everything. And like I said, there was so much of me that felt lost. But I think what we all reflect upon, especially if you have the benefit, like I said, I'm grateful to have had 20 years with my mother. They have that foundation. So I think in the Black experience, when you lose a loved one, generally your parents have set such a great foundation for you that we are able to be a little more, that church community that you do tend to have does kind of come in. And I think the Black experience in general has kind of always been one of like community. And so I do feel like even though you may feel alone and isolated after death in the Black experience, you are surrounded by so much community. They are going to be bringing food over, all of that. I remember those like food over. They're going to check in on you. They're going to be telling you they're praying for you. So I do appreciate that. Like we have such a great community that holds up and supports people when they are grieving.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing all of that. And yeah, I appreciate the transparency too. It's interesting because I think that having something you believe in, God, a higher power, et cetera, is so powerful in being able to help you get through these dark times. And like you're saying, sometimes you also need a different kind of help than
Absolutely.
like you also need there. Like I think these things can go together, right? Faith, prayer, therapy, they're all related and yet their own thing. So, and everyone's unique. It's like whatever works for that person works best for that person. And I love that you were able to use your faith and therapy to help you guide through these very challenging experiences you've had.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about your blog and your awesome podcast, Travel, Pray, and Slay? I love that you say if you love God, travel, and Beyonce, then this is your tribe. 3 specific things that we love. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, 3 specific things that I definitely love. So Travel Pray Slay, you said it. It's an online platform for women. You know, as a Black woman, I focus on women of color that are ready to level up. And so on the podcast, I talk about everything from travel. So I originally started I had a travel blog in 2012. It was actually called Miss Travel Chic. And, you know, again, as social media has evolved, right? It used to just be blogging. And as it started transitioning to podcasts, I changed the name, and, you know, I wanted to find a way to incorporate all the things that are important values to me, right? So travel being one of them. After my experience, you know, with my parents and working in the corporate world, I had this moment where I decided I wanted to like pursue a different passion. And so I quit my corporate job at the time. And then I spent some time writing a book. And so I wrote this book, Ordinary Women, Extraordinary Purpose, 21 Ways to Walk Boldly into the Life that you were created to live. And it's really like my story. So I talk a lot in there about, you know, grief. And so that was like a faith component for me. And then, yeah, I love Beyonce. I love what she represents, women empowerment. And so that became, you know, a part of my life, especially as I was, you know, growing up myself as an empowered single woman out in this world. And so I was like, you know what? I travel, I pray is important, and I slay. So like Beyonce, so that kind of became the name and the tagline and the motivation behind it. And so, yeah, I talk about everything from, it's so funny. We were just talking about therapy and faith. I did a recent podcast with a counselor called It's Okay to Have Jesus and a Therapist.
Ooh, I love that. That's perfect. That's so interesting. How did that go?
It was great. And we talked about the very thing, like I discussed, just stigmas associated with it, why there are some things you can't talk to a pastor about bipolar disorder. You can't talk to a pastor. I'm sorry, pastor, you are not equipped to discuss, you know, ADHD or my narcissistic boyfriend. So why that's important, and just the community experience and kind of some of the reasons why Black people have strayed away from that. So that was great. Self-care routine, travel tips. So that's what it's all about. You know, I really just want to encourage people to expand their world, discover their purpose. I truly feel like travel is a spiritual experience. I truly feel like travel opens you up to so much. It has changed my worldview, and I'm so glad it did. It allows you to understand and better relate to just humanity in general and all the differences that make us better. And I just think it allows you to be a better human. and, you know, even you don't have to go to Thailand or Australia. You know, when I relocated to Chicago when I was 27 years old, like that was a culture shock for me. You know, that's a big multicultural city. And I grew like the Bible Belt, you know, Texas and small towns. So that opened me up. And so I just think anytime people are able to travel, but I definitely want to encourage women. I'm all about like going to the next level and tapping into your purpose and being that extraordinary person that you can be. And so that's what I seek to do on the podcast, is just provide those tips for women to be able to elevate their experience.
Fantastic. I love that so much. And I love those 3 pillars. Can you have 3 pillars? 3 points of the triangle: travel,
Yes.
praying, and slay. We love it. We love it. Because it is the Dying of Laughter podcast, is there a comedic moment surrounding your grief experience that comes to mind? Or another way to think about it is like so bizarre or weird that you just had to laugh. And if that doesn't resonate, that is okay as well.
Okay, this may be TMI, but I'm going to tell it anyway because
Please.
It's funny and whatever, you know. I can remember. So as I said, my mother was a single mom and she never remarried, you know, and a lot of that was she just didn't want to like bring somebody in over. And I think when I graduated high school, I think she was starting to think about dating again and whatnot, but then she was really sick or whatever. So she was a single woman or whatever. And I just remember, so again, I'm 20 at the time she passes. So I am now aware of life and sex and all these things like that, right? And so all I will say is there was a moment where me and my sister were like cleaning out, her room and different things like that. And we found her, things that women enjoy too. And I mean, we both were like so embarrassed. I at the time I knew of these things, but I myself was not. And obviously my older sister knew. And it was just like this moment where I'm like, oh, my mother was a woman, because it's like, she's a mom to me.
Right.
And my mother would try to talk to me about sex, especially when I got in college. And I was like, man, I want to hear about that,
Yeah.
So we found her stash.
Oh my gosh.
Everyone knows. I'm sure everyone knows what that means.
And to be clear, you found this after she died. You were cleaning
after she died. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
It was, my sister just laughed. And it's funny because we will still bring it up every now and then too, and just have this laugh. She was like, girl, can you believe we found her vibrator?
I love it so much. And you know what? It humanizes all of us. Like, death is the great equalizer. It's the thing it's the only thing that we will all go through, although in different ways. We will all experience death. And yet, it's full circle, life to death, right? And we are born into this life through sex. Yes, our parents have vibrators. That is terrifying. I'm sorry that some of us have to see them. Some of us don't. You are one of the gifted ones that got to see that. So thank you for sharing. It's like hilarious and not and real. And it's just like raw. This is life, right?
It's life. Exactly. I'm like, but we sometimes put our parents in these little boxes or whatever, and they do the same for us too, right? And so then when you come to this reality of, that, and it's funny because it's one of the things that I wish I could have experienced, because again, my sister was older. So I always ask her stuff. I'm like, okay, tell me more about what mom said about sex and her boyfriends, because at the time, when I was in like middle school, my sister is like in her 30s and stuff. And so, my mother and her would have those conversations. My mother was a woman in her 40s. And like I said, she never wanted to remarry. Like she got, a guy wanted to marry her, and she was just like, my baby's at home. Like, no. And so, but my sister got to have those conversations with her. And so I'm like always asking my sister, what did she say about this? Or, sometimes when I'm talking to my sister about relationships and stuff, she'll kind of say, girl, you sound like mama or something, because she, as an adult, got to experience having that with our mother, and I didn't. But that little moment, humanized her in that way for me.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing this, Toya. Do you have closing thoughts for our listeners? And do you have any questions for me?
Okay. You know what I would say for your listeners, I think the biggest thing for me, it's funny because like you can tell, I mean, I was obviously close with my mother. We grew up, it was just me and her. And there were moments where even my siblings were like, she's not going to make it, because it's like we were that close. And I sometimes look back and I'm like, how did I get through that? Right? Because you hear people now say, oh my God, if so-and-so ever passed, I would fall, y'all would have to get me out there. But you never know what life is going to bring you. And it was just a reminder to me of just how strong we all are and how much resilience we have and tenacity. Were there dark times? Absolutely. I've shared those. I've talked through those. But just know that, like, no matter what comes in the wake of death, you can get through it. And, even times like we're in now with the pandemic, it's just this really unique thing, because this year will be the 20th anniversary of my mother's death. There's a lot of death around. And I was sharing with a close friend who's a counselor. I was like, it's not that things are coming up for me. It's not unprocessed, but it's just like a reminder. And so many people are now experiencing things like what you and I experience, and death is like super real. Like you can literally go to the grocery store, catch a virus and die. And before it wasn't that. And so even just this pandemic reminds me and reminds us all, I think we've even seen it on display, that we are a lot stronger than we think. And even if you think, oh my God, I would fall apart, because I thought the same thing, I would fall apart, I would drop out of college. Like here I am 20 years later. And of course I have my moments. Like if I start talking too long about, her, I'll start crying now. But I can get through, and there is still life, and you should not be afraid to. A lot of people feel guilty. I'll say this too, not being afraid to live your life after you lose those people close to you. Like I don't, there are times where I used to get so stuck on, well, my mother wanted me to stay at this job, or my mother wanted me to do this. And I'm like, I love you, Mom, but I got to live my life now. You aren't here at the end of the day. She isn't here. And that doesn't say anything about the memories or how much I love her, but I have to live my life, and you should not feel guilty for moving on, in a sense, because while you still have breath, there's still a purpose for you on this earth, and we never know when our time is going to come. So I would just encourage people to, if you are going through grief right now, not feeling guilty about moving on and living your life, and just be grateful for the time that you had with those loved ones.
So true. I appreciate that closing thought about not being afraid to live your own best life, because, they say that's what the person would have wanted for you. Yeah. And it's like kind of cheesy, but it's also true, but it's also easy to just like not do that.
Yeah.
And just to like, keep your head down. It's like, no, we only have one life, like you're saying, and we don't know when our own time can come. And it's not about living in fear of that, but it's also about getting real. Like, best case scenario, you live to 100. So a lot of people that you might know might be a third away of their life or more even now.
Absolutely.
And it's not depressing. It's just like, oh, let's process that for a second. How would you like to live your life knowing that? Toya, when do you feel most alive?
Wow. I mean, honestly, when I travel. And again, I get that from my mother. Like she traveled so much. The first big trip that I took, I was 12 years old, and she sent me away on this educational tour, 9 days in Mexico. And I'm like, who sends their child away to Mexico, girl? But she did. But she trusted. It was a Spanish teacher I had at the time. And she said, she was like, I think it's so important for her my Spanish teacher was a Black woman. And she wanted like people of color to experience this. And my mother was like, sure, I would want her to have a cultural experience like this. I didn't get to have this. My mother just had a high school education, was from a small town, Oklahoma, got married at 19. So she always wanted more for her kids. And so I just think travel started for me so early. I feel my most alive self when I am able to, and it's not about like laying on the beach with a Mai Tai. I was just in DC last weekend and just taking in the culture from visiting the Smithsonian museums. I just feel like good, because there's something about experiencing something new and being taken out of my element that just makes me feel like I'm doing it,
Yes. I'm doing that. I love the way that you said that. It's so true. And you don't have to travel the entire world. Like, yes, no. Traveling the world is amazing. If anyone has the opportunity, like, please do that as well. But I'm with you, like in a new state, even in a new city, somewhere a couple hours away that you've never been before. And just like having the food and meeting the people can just bring such joy. So I'm excited to learn more about what you're doing with your awesome podcast and blog. Where can people connect with you online and learn more about these things?
Awesome. So my website is travelprayslay.com. You can listen to the podcast there. You can check out some merchandise. I've got shirts, hoodies, luggage tags, and some blogs on there as well. And my book is on there. The book is also on Amazon. But if you buy it from my website, I'll autograph it for you and write you a cool note.
Love that. Obsessed.
Yeah. And on social media, you can find me on Instagram at travelprayslay. And on Twitter, I am at Toya Nicole Media. That's also my personal Instagram at Toya Nicole Media. So that's Toya, Nicole, Nicole media. My personal Instagram, my personal Twitter, and my podcast account is at Travel, Pray, and Slay on Instagram. I'm on TikTok now, but don't follow me because I'm still getting my life together.
Wait, I'm literally lolling. Oh my gosh.
I'm trying it out. I like just downloaded it because I have to be a cool kid, but like you won't find entertaining content.
No, I'm obsessed with that, honestly. Like, you just hit a chord. I think that's going to strike, like, that's going to hit so many people. It's like, yeah, I have this thing, but just, I don't know. I'm working on it. But you know what? You put it out into the universe that you have started. Yes. And I'm just laughing so hard.
I have started TikTok at Travel, Pray, Slay, but my life is not together. So do not come there expecting viral content.
That is so good. Wait, that's actually one of my favorite things that anyone has ever said about TikTok, like possibly ever. So actually, thank you so much for that. Toya, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated getting to learn more about your story, especially people who've experienced loss of both parents are going to really relate to this. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chelsea. This was so fun. You are awesome host, and I love this conversation.
Yodo, you only die once.